Introduction to AR005, The Illustrated Plato's Atlantis. First edition. Original posting 14 August 2024. I posted the main body of this volume in a separate video linked in the description entitled AR005, The Illustrated Plato's Atlantis, First Edition, to avoid putting everyone through this full introduction every time they watch the main feature. So don't get confused when you get to the end of this video and wonder what exactly was being introduced. You've started at the right place because this introduction anticipates a number of questions, both historical and technical, that you are likely to raise while watching the main feature. Please watch this video at least once before moving on to the main feature, linked in the description. Artificial intelligence in visual rendering tools was only just emerging at the time this video was created. The imagery it renders with my guidance, based on Plato's text, is as good as any of the people, places, and events of prehistory, without the laborious contributions of learned human artists over months and years, artists who would quickly tire of my commandeering attention to detail. While the imagery and drama that AI can conjure from linear text is often impressive and impossible to efficiently match by other means, and especially while it doesn't complain about long hours and meticulous details, its best publicly available storytelling tools have not yet risen to the task of reliably projecting the visual realization of an idea more than 4 seconds into the future. Moreover, the knowledge bases of most AI rendering tools still have many gaps, the vast majority of which won't be filled for many years. Distracting quirks sometimes crop up in the AI rendering and movement of complex objects. Hands, for instance, which most of us take for granted, but in the rendering of which the tool often fails spectacularly. And in one instance, a time-traveling hipster in sunglasses peeked out from behind an onlooker at Socrates' Symposium. These little quirks force me to reject and replace an otherwise perfectly usable segment over the time-consuming course of many attempts. Coincidentally, Critias makes a similar point in requesting the indulgence of the theater audience in his presentation on Atlantis, that human things are more difficult to depict convincingly by contrast to nature and natural landscapes. The same is true of AI rendering tools as they exist today. On behalf of Critias, on behalf of AI, and on behalf of myself, therefore, I must pass forward in time this enduring request for indulgence to you. Besides hands, there are other things the tool could not yet render, such as triremes, ancient warships with 3 decks of rowers in addition to any sails, and Egyptian-style horse-drawn war chariots, both of which were used by the Atlantean military forces, according to Plato's account. Sanchez mentions triremes in describing the Atlantean urban center and naval base. These triremes would have had square sails, as evidenced indirectly, for example, in the stories surrounding Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon in the 12th or 13th century BCE, in which Agamemnon is told to have sacrificed her to the gods in an appeal for favorable winds for the Trojan campaign. This drew the ire of his wife, who by some accounts promptly avenged her daughter upon Agamemnon's return after 10 years at Troy. By other accounts, the sacrifice was faked using a proxy, and Iphigenia went into exile to keep the ploy secret. Returning to the point, antediluvian triremes most probably had square sails. Modern triangular spinnaker sails, invented according to modern accounts in 1865, do not need a tailwind to make forward progress in any direction. If you see modern-looking sailing vessels in this volume, therefore, just substitute in a square-sailed trireme in your mind's eye, with the acknowledgement that we cannot rule out more advanced sailing technology in the antediluvian world without substantial contravening evidence, because, as the saying goes, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I could not find any reason to differentiate the Atlantean war chariots which were mentioned in the narrative on the division of military contributions among the various Atlantean districts in Plato's Critias from the post-diluvian Greek and Egyptian war chariots, with which most of us are familiar. These details are important as they constitute evidence of a total reset of both Greek and Atlantean military technology from which Atlantis never recovered, and from which the Greek world would not recover for many thousands of years, thus corroborating the plain language assurance of these facts that we get from the Egyptian priest. Sanchez told of a catastrophic reset, and we would be foolish to stop believing him now. We can reasonably adduce, moreover, that if the Atlanteans had triremes 12,000 years ago, yet by inference from the text were defeated by Proto-Athenians in their own territory, then the Athenians must also have had triremes 12,000 years ago. Since the Atlanteans, according to the Egyptian priesthood, quote, held sway in our direction over the country within the pillars, end quote, before the Proto-Athenians beat them back, we might also infer that the Proto-Athenian and Atlantean trireme designs had a common origin all those millennia ago. This full and linear exposition of Plato's written record also includes a brief glimpse into the heart-stopping details of the antediluvian destruction of prehistoric Athens. Yes, Athens, Greece, which were glossed over in previous volumes, focused on the mind-boggling fate of Atlantis in the prehistoric Green Sahara. The Egyptian priesthood tells us these early Holocene destruction events thus prevented this story from coming to light in the Greek world for thousands of years, until the advent of Solon's visit to Sais, then at the head of the ever-expanding Nile Delta, circa 600 BCE. And there the story lay in Solon's care, who, according to Critias, had intended to write an epic poem about it, but was distracted throughout his life by matters of politics, international diplomacy, and statecraft. For reasons to be covered shortly, the AI rendering tool knows what the hill of the Acropolis looks like today, but can't reproduce it the way Critias describes it, as it existed before the 9,400 BCE deluge in his account, and before, quote, the extraordinary inundation, which was the third before the great destruction of Deucalion, end quote. Based on his account, this extraordinary inundation seems to have originated from the same event that destroyed Atlantis, and to have militated with the, quote, single night of excessive rain, end quote, to destroy the city of Athens and wash away most of the hill of the Acropolis. The drawbacks mentioned above in the AI rendering tool result from deficiencies in the knowledge base upon which it draws to render the objects corresponding to certain terms. Those of us familiar with the subject matter can render these objects in our mind's eye in real time without conscious effort. This makes it easy for us to forget that triremes and war chariots, primitive though they may seem compared to, say, submarines and tanks, are compound and inherently complex assemblages that most submarine captains and tank commanders would struggle to control. We should not be surprised, therefore, to see the primitive AI imaging tools of today struggle to render them. Similarly, there's nothing in the AI knowledge base about Athens before it was destroyed, because modern society has not yet come to grips with these geologically recent but still prehistoric destruction events. AI won't be able to reproduce through lexical analysis historical events that its host society has not yet acknowledged ever happened, and whose language is for this reason deficient in the terms with which to identify and describe them. It can make reasonable guesses about, say, prehistoric Athens or Solutrean clothing, for example, but not about antediluvian Athens or the double docks carved into the banks of the Atlantis urban center described in Plato's account. As explained by the Egyptian priest Sanchez to the Greek statesman Solon, these parts of our history have been erased from our collective memory by recurring natural cataclysms. They are therefore also missing from our AI knowledge bases. By far, the most overused word in popular archaeology when discussing the possibilities of antediluvian civilizations is the word advanced, a word which should always be fully qualified, unless used in the relational sense, i.e., more advanced or less advanced, when comparing stages of social or technological development, at least one of which is well understood. In depicting Atlantean civilization in this volume, I granted the AI rendering tool wide latitude in deciding on the level of advancement, most particularly on the level of architectural development, sometimes just telling it Atlantean or Atlantis, and letting it draw inspiration from its own knowledge base, with the understanding that that knowledge base is the product of both factual and fanciful social constructs. You will therefore find yourself wondering how such awe-inspiring architecture could have been destroyed without a trace by any natural catastrophe, and I'd like to welcome you to the club in advance. Though factual traces are beginning to emerge, Atlantis survives today mostly in the imagination of Atlantis hunters, as it did for the descendants of the simple mountain shepherds of antediluvian Greece, from whom we received the bulk of Greek mythology. That's why Plato's detailed account had to come from Egypt. I allowed the social constructs from both ancient and modern mythology already accumulated in the AI knowledge base in association with these keywords to peek through uninhibited. With all that said, by reducing in our minds the Atlantis depicted by Plato to the bare minimum that depiction allows, we can each form a personal basis for estimating, each to our own satisfaction, a lower limit to the magnitude of the natural catastrophe that utterly destroyed it. Plato was an Athenian academic, the first Athenian academic in that he founded one of the earliest known academies, referred to by historians as Plato's Academy or the academic school. This and the fact that Solon, of whom Plato writes, having been an Athenian circa 600 BCE, and an Athenian statesman at that, means that the story is told from the Athenian perspective, even though it originated from Solon's meeting with the Egyptian priesthood. This Athenian chain of telling and recording continues with the transmission of Solon's apparently written account to Dropides in 600 BCE. From Dropides to Critias the Elder, from Critias the Elder to Critias the Younger, from Critias the Younger to the scribes at Socrates' Symposium circa 400 BCE, before being finally collected for posterity by Plato, circa 360 BCE. In the perspective thus received from the Egyptian priest Sancius of Sais, representing the close allies of Athens going back at least 9,000 years according to the story, the Athenians were the heroes and saviors of the antediluvian world against an overwhelming force of, quote, unprovoked, end quote, barbarian aggressors about 11,400 years ago. The reason Critias gave for choosing this story was not so much to contrast Athenian to Atlantean culture, both of which he vaunted in a positive light, as to inform Socrates, the esteemed and revered host of the symposium, that the Athenian society of 9,000 years before was precisely the ideal society that Socrates had described in his presentation on the previous day. A presentation which we know today as the Republic. On this basis, the more likely truth of the conflict between Proto-Athens and Atlantis is that the inevitable economic rivalry between an established and far-ranging Atlantean trade network on the one hand and emerging economies in the Mediterranean on the other, upon which both had established a dependency, led just as inevitably to a military conflict between the two. The confines of the Mediterranean turned their economic rivalry into a zero-sum game with only one winner. We are told, however, by the figures in Plato's account, speaking to us from Socrates' Symposium circa 400 BCE, that nature, not mankind, decided the ultimate outcome of that antediluvian conflict at least twice removed, in a series of events almost as ancient to them as it is to us. The vague intimations of Atlantean social decline described by Critias under the watchful eye of Socrates on Athena's day of festival in central Athens seem almost made up as a justification for the gods' punishment, and to contrast Atlantean culture to the Proto-Athenian culture that Critias describes in the same story. While this assessment serves its purpose in pleasing Socrates, however, it breaks down as a morality lesson when we consider that this ideal Proto-Athenian culture suffered a fate similar to that of Atlantis by the same turn of events. In the objective third-party perspective, there is nothing good nor bad, neither described nor that we might infer from this account about Atlantean culture that was not common to Athenian culture, let alone to the wider world at the time. Atlantis and Athens came into competition with one another in the Mediterranean and fought. The Athenian fleet pursued the Atlanteans back to Atlantis, and nature settled the argument. We can infer this sequence of events from the account of Sanchez, in which, quote, all your warlike men of Athens, in a body, sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis, the small island in which the citadel was built, in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea, end quote. We can understand the sea as referring to the temporary floodwaters of the deluge, channeled into the city center by an accidental once-in-100 lifetimes hazard in the design of the sprawling Atlantian aqueous transport and collection network. As illustrated in previous volumes, this temporary flood zone is likely to have been wide enough such that witnesses at a safe distance could not see the opposite shore. This, to ancient peoples, destitute of maps and an aerial perspective, was the definition of the sea. The central island of Atlantis then subsided in a catastrophic mudslide that washed, pushed, and carried everything into the once navigable waterway, filling it up with earth, pushing and pouring into existence, quote, a shoal of mud in the way, end quote, at the coastal access point of any ship that later came looking for the bustling utopian city of legend. By all accounts, everyone on both sides of the conflict between the Atlanteans and the Proto-Athenians about 11,400 years ago had an earth-shattering stroke of astrophysical, seismic, and meteorological hard luck, coinciding in the modern climatological record with the onset of the Younger Dryas meltwater pulse 1b. Based on the details we get from Plato as reviewed in previous volumes, this natural cataclysm best matches the profile of an oceanic bolide strike. No one at Socrates' Symposium debated the terminal impact, if you will, of this event on the outcome of that conflict. The destruction of Atlantis and Proto-Athens both included earthquakes, floods, and, quote, a single day and night of misfortune, end quote, in the case of Atlantis as recorded in the Timaeus, and, quote, a single night of excessive rain, end quote, in the case of Athens as recorded in the Critias. While it is not thus made clear the multiple similarities described in this one and only foundational narrative about the lost city of Atlantis, we may reasonably infer that both locations were affected by the same event. The Rishat structure in North Africa and the city of Athens in the northeastern Mediterranean are separated by just over 2,000 nautical miles. The likelihood we may infer from the narrative of a single event causing earthquakes and floods in two such widely separated geographic locations should incline us in favor of a seafloor impact over an airburst as the root cause of this widespread destruction, and to place a lower bound on the explosive yield at impact. You will also encounter parts of the story, early in its delivery, in which Critias seems to be just warming himself up to the situation he finds himself in at Socrates' Symposium circa 400 BCE, having to conjure this tale from memory, as he had apparently left the written account handed down to him by his great-grandfather Dropides, with which he had been intimately familiar since the age of 10, back at home in the watchful keeping of his family. while Critias deliberations with his memory and with its mother goddess Mnemosyne may create unwanted drama for people eager to hear the story, they also help to solidify the historicity of his account for those who would question the purpose of such hemming and hawing in a fictional allegory. I welcome your earnest nitpicks and fact checks in the comments, which I will promptly verify and incorporate into the next edition, which may, however, not come out until enough validated comments have been collected and incorporated to justify the publication of another edition. That said, I hope that most of us in this audience are well past ancient aliens, the endless slew of alternative locations for Atlantis, and dubious conflations of this narrative with others, whose historicity and relationship to it remain unsupportable. We can talk about space aliens in a separate video if you want, but there is no need whatsoever to invoke them in the case of Atlantis. On the contrary, if aliens were involved, why didn't they just deflect the younger Dryas and Burkle objects using their much vaunted propulsion technology? As you can see, catastrophic events like the Atlantis destruction do more to discount the involvement of aliens than to invoke it. Let's be happy with the earth tones and exotic locations of archaeology, and leave the sky tones and contrails of exobiology to another day. Now you're ready for AR005, the illustrated Plato's Atlantis, linked in the description. Thanks for doing your homework. With all these points in mind, it's time to enjoy the ride through Plato's antediluvian world.